Okay, so let's talk Shroud of Turin. I'm doing it this way with the image because I want people to be able to see what I'm talking about. And I first got interested in the Shroud of Turin. I was actually in Turin visiting friends, and I had some time to kill. And I saw, oh, Museum of the Shroud. I'm like, oh, let me go see how the fake was made. And I got there, and there's a little, film thing that they show you because you can't see the real shroud. And one thing I learned that I'll never forget is if the shroud was a fake, they wouldn't be able to replicate it today. So moving on, there are kind of two camps in terms of viewing the shroud. There's the scientific camp, and there's the emotion, which is fact and evidence based, and there's the emotional camp, which is what I want to be true. Okay, so scientific evidence. The shroud itself, the piece of cloth dates from the first century AD. That has been determined. There, it did undergo carbon dating, which people always point to and say, "Oh, but it went on. It was determined to be a medieval fake in the 80s." They actually performed the carbon dating on a piece of the shroud that had been added in the sometime in medieval times by some French nuns because they felt like they didn't want to keep handling the actual shroud, so they added like a frame so that when they had to handle it, they weren't putting their grubby hands all over this image that they believed at the time to be the image of Christ. So the carbon dating was performed on a piece of cloth that was a medieval piece of cloth. Moving on. Next, pollens in the cloth correspond to pollens in Jerusalem in the first century AD. And of course, the pollens in Jerusalem in the East are not the same as the pollens in France or Italy, right? And so, what is known for sure about the shroud is it popped up in France in the 14th century in a place called Lire in the Champagne district of France, which is maybe a couple hours from Paris, so it's in the north. Then it traveled from there to Chambéry, also in France, and then it ended up in Turin. And if you look at a map, it's kind of a straight line. But the point is, that is what is known about the shroud. And so to us, like how if it was a from France, if it was originally from, how did it end up with pollens from Jerusalem, right? But again, this is scientific evidence. This isn't emotion, right? Like the emotion that, oh, I've decided that the shroud is a fake because I want it to be a fake. Or I've decided that the shroud is real because I want it to be real. Let's look at the actual evidence. So the pollens. Now let's go on to the markings on the cloth. The cloth itself just looks like a stained piece of cloth that anyone might have in their garage. It looks like a tarp that is sitting in my garage right now. It's got some blobs on it. You wouldn't necessarily look at it twice unless you knew what to look for. What people say, oh, it's paint. Well, first of all, it's not paint. And the scientific approach is that I don't know if you guys have heard, they can tell the difference between paint and blood scientifically. We do have that technology nowadays. Surprise, surprise, surprise. So there is no paint on the shroud. On this piece of cloth, there is blood. Which is AB negative type blood, and there is serum, so which corresponds to the wound in the person's side. There are on the back, because we do have the front and the back, right? The shroud, like I said, it was like 4 meters long, so over 12 feet long, so it covered front and back. The person had approximately 120, 150 flesh wounds. The person had been flogged with the kind of cat of nine tails with little pieces of metal, like little metal hooks attached to the end, so that they would rip the flesh off the body as the person was flogged. And the person was flogged by 2 different people. So this information I'm getting from a guy named Philippe Bourseau. He is a French coroner. So he's a forensic pathologist, I think is what it's called, and that's his job. He's not a Christian. He's just a coroner. He looked at the shroud, and this is what he said. You can tell that one of the 2 people flogging the body in the shroud was taller and one was shorter. Okay. So we have that. So not there is no paint. And again, we are able scientifically in 2025 to tell the difference between paint and body fluids. So the markings on the cloth uh, are, but okay, so some of the stains on the cloth are body fluid, but the actual image on the shroud, how did we come up with the image on the shroud? And look, up until 1898, when people looked at this cloth, they, like you and I would see a stained piece of cloth. They didn't really, like, if they knew what to look for, again, the religious people thought it was, or pretended to think it was, the actual shroud of Christ, or they pretended to think that. But anybody just looking at it might have their doubts. But in 1898, the church asked, they hired a guy to photograph the shroud. His name was Secondo Pia. He was a lawyer. He was an attorney in Turin, and he was also a photographer. So he was hired to photograph the shroud. He said later in an interview that he had been really concerned about how, because what he saw was a stained piece of cloth. And I think he was a believer, but, at the same time, like, I've always been a believer, but at the same time, I thought the Shroud of Turin was a fake, right? So he might have believed, but still felt like, And then, if you've ever had to take a picture for eBay or something, or for Amazon because you received an item that was stained, like, how hard it is to actually take a picture where you see the stain, like you see with the naked eye. So he was concerned. He said later that he was concerned about how this was going to turn out. But, so he just, he gets whatever, decides to try his best, takes his photographs, goes in the dark room, which if you're under the age of 40, you might not even know what that is, goes in the dark room, and the photographic negative shows this fully formed image of a man, which we have all seen, which has made the rounds of the whole world, and which is what leads people to believe that it's fake, because they think, how can that possibly be? And so what he realized after he picked himself up off the floor, which anybody would, when you're expecting to see some blobs on a piece of cloth and try and make the best of it as a photographer, and you see a fully formed image of a man, you're going to drop your panties too. So he picks himself off the floor and realizes that the image on the shroud itself, on this piece of cloth itself, is itself a photographic negative. So what people had been seeing for 2 millennia, and as the image, was actually a photographic negative. And that's the thing that no one would be able to reproduce even today. How do you produce a photographic negative on a piece of cloth from a dead body? I mean, how does a dead body produce a photographic negative? How does anyone in the first century, or even for those of you who continue to insist that despite the evidence, even in the 13th century, how do you produce a photographic negative from a dead body, a scourged and crucified man on a piece of cloth, right? We would not be able to do it today. Science would not be able to do it today, FYI. And the image is also 3-dimensional, just to add that. So anyway, that's pretty much it about the shroud. Now the really interesting thing is they're doing so much testing and so much messing with the shroud. Those of you who don't believe the shroud is real, that's okay, because pretty soon it's not going to be real, because they're going to destroy it. They are poking and prying at this thing, trying to figure it out, and everybody's just so proud of what they discovered. But every time they mess with this 2,000-year-old piece of cloth, they're destroying it a little bit more. So don't worry. If you don't believe the shroud is real, pretty soon it won't be real, because it'll be completely destroyed. But and the last thing I want to add is, whether you believe or you don't believe, we're not just talking about, and this is something that it took me a while to understand, we're not just talking about stains on the cloth made by a dead body that was wounded and crucified in the way described, of Jesus. But sure, it could have been another scourged and crucified man, even though at the time Roman law said you only got one punishment. It was unlawful to give someone 2 punishments. So scourging was a punishment, crucifixion was a punishment, right? The thieves on the cross by Jesus, they didn't get scourged, they just got crucified. Jesus got both punishments unlawfully, right? In defiance of Roman law, he was given two punishments. So again, this is a way that this shroud corresponds with the story from the Bible. Now you can decide this is a totally different person, a totally different 2,000-year-old person who was scourged and crucified and also had a crown of thorns, because we see that also in the image. And unlike the description that you, or the depiction that you often see, according to this French coroner, Boxall, he said that the crown was more like an actual cap. It wasn't just like a ringlet of thorns. It was like an actual, almost like a football helmet of thorns, and thorns meaning cacti, right? Because they're out in the desert. So those thorns are bitches, right? Like, I mean, I have blackberry bushes and they're bad, but can you imagine cacti being shoved down on your head? So he said it was more of a cap. But the thing is, it's not just stains left on this cloth. I mean, the point of the shroud is for those who are willing to at least entertain Occam's razor. Meaning, what is Occam's razor? William of Occam, who said, in terms of solving a mystery or a dilemma or a problem, usually the solution that hits the most bases with the fewest runs around the bases is the correct one. So with the fewest mental gymnastics, right? With the fewest hoops that you have to jump through, the most obvious solution as to what is the Shroud of Turin is that it is exactly what we think it is. It is not just the burial cloth of Jesus. It is the photograph of the actual resurrection, because to produce a photographic negative, you need like millions of watts of light, millions of watts of energy in like a split second of time. What is going to produce that amount of energy from inside a dead body in the first century in Jerusalem? Don't worry, I'll wait. Okay? The only, basically you're talking about splitting the atom. And so, I mean, I guess, again, Occam's razor points to the most obvious solution, but if that isn't to your liking, you can continue to believe what you want to believe. But my question is, why? Why is it so important? I mean, if you want to be scientific, then you have to weigh the evidence and accept where the evidence leads. And we saw the same thing during, well, I don't want to get into that, but we see the same thing all the time. People decide what they want to believe and they look for evidence to support that. Why don't you keep an open mind? I mean, what is it costing you to keep an open mind? I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's not just atheists or whatever who want to believe that the shroud is fake. I have been in multiple Christian churches where they insist that the Shroud of Turin is fake. And to be honest with you, like, for me, this is more of a scientific exercise than anything else. I mean, I was already a believer with or without the shroud. I was already a believer. But what I find confusing and interesting is why people need to believe that the shroud is fake. And I don't know the answer to that. And maybe someone else can come up with the answer. So have a great day.